Western leaders say that further work is needed on the US-Russia negotiated proposal to end the war in Ukraine. US President Donald Trump announced he's giving Ukraine until next Thursday to accept a 28-point proposal that largely favours Russia. The White House has reportedly threatened to withdraw American support for Ukraine if the deadline is not met. Kyiv will hold consultations in Switzerland with the US and Germany, Britain and France. The news of the US-Russian peace plan is overshadowing the G20 Leaders Summit, which is getting underway in South Africa. The first G20 gathering in Africa was meant to discuss helping poor nations, but the US proposal on Ukraine blindsided EU leaders in attendance. They've been scrambling to respond and hold emergency talks on the sidelines of the summit. Earlier, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had this to say.
I want to make it very clear that the war can only end if Ukraine gives its unqualified agreement. Wars can't be ended by the big powers acting over the heads of the countries involved. The war can only end with the consent of Ukraine and of Europe, as it's a war being fought on the continent of Europe.
DW Chief Political Editor Michaela Küfner is in Johannesburg, travelling with German Chancellor Merz, and is at the G20 summit, I believe. Michaela, what else did the German Chancellor have to say?
Well, first of all, that sentence that we just heard, I was standing just a few meters next to him when he was saying that. I was wondering whether that will actually age well. He has made some diplomatic success because he was the European leader who got Donald Trump on the phone just before he stepped on that plane on Friday evening, and he did get Donald Trump to agree to actually negotiate these 28 points, which Trump's advisor Witkoff says is a plan. Marco Rubio called more of a collection of ideas, and that's where the Europeans saw a bit of room for maneuver, and it looks like Donald Trump has granted that. He is sending advisors, it's not quite clear whom, to Geneva. The German Chancellor has sent back his top foreign policy advisor, and European advisors will be at the table as well, and of course Volodymyr Zelensky. But what they all want to prevent, and they had a side meeting here this afternoon in Johannesburg when really they were supposed to talk about sustainability and growing debt in Africa and other areas of the world. They had this emergency meeting looking at the 28-point plan. They've communicated back to Donald Trump where they want to see changes. And the key issue is, of course, how this all came about. That is over the head of Ukraine and also over the head of the Europeans, who had absolutely no say in this document initially being drafted. So now we're seeing the Europeans try and push this in a different direction, and it's still very open indeed whether they will succeed and whether this will actually produce a document that will be signed in some shape or form this coming Thursday.
Michaela, can you tell us more about what Europe would hope to get out of this current plan?
Well, they literally need to get some passages cancelled out of there. The Europeans simply cannot live with the fact that Ukraine now is supposed to surrender territory, large parts of territory, that there are limitations on NATO membership they can potentially live with, but that the United States position themselves in one of those paragraphs saying that they will be a go-between between NATO and Russia. That points to a further withdrawal of the United States. That would mean that Europe is home alone if the Russian President Vladimir Putin doesn't stick to any kind of security guarantees. This is not a historic first. Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons initially in exchange for security guarantees, which were then broken by Russia. So there's little trust there. An expectation on the side of the Europeans is that the United States would also offer a completely different level of security guarantees in there. We have not seen the document. It's a conscious decision not to leak this, not to let anything seep out, because there's a strong feeling that there's an urgent need for some room for manoeuvre for those Geneva talks and for the days and hours ahead.
Our Chief Political Editor, Michaela Küfner in Johannesburg. Thank you.
All right, let's get some analysis now. And we're joined by William Courtney. He is an adjunct senior fellow at the think tank RAND. Great to have you on DW News. So, based on what we know of the 28-point US peace plan, how would you characterise Washington's objectives here?
It seems that the US negotiators have accepted Russia's position on virtually every point. And this is really puzzling. Even the Kremlin has been circumspect today in how it characterizes the plan. For example, the Kremlin spokesman Peskov said, well, there had not been consultations, only contacts. This may suggest that the Kremlin realizes this plan is a non-starter. It has no hope whatsoever of being successful.
All right. What do you think then are the primary motives here then, or Washington's primary motives here?
Certainly President Trump wants to bring an end to the fighting, and that's a noble goal. But in both cases, the Russians with Kirill Dmitriev and the White House with Steve Witkoff are negotiators who do not have much background with regard to the Ukraine situation. So this seems to be a plan that was prepared, perhaps hastily, without expert advice. And so from the Washington's perspective, perhaps the White House was shocked that President Zelensky and three European leaders today issued a statement. It's clear that Ukraine enjoys the confidence of Europeans and vice versa. It's no longer the case between the US and Ukraine.
All right, well then, how likely is a reduction then in US support possible, and how fast could that become operationally dangerous for Ukraine?
Well, it's important to remember that now only Europe is providing financial aid and military aid to Ukraine. The United States is providing some intelligence for situational awareness and targeting, which is quite valuable for Ukraine in attacking distant targets in Russia. But otherwise, the United States is only selling arms to Europe, which would then retransfer them to Ukraine. So Europe has by far the most leverage in this situation. While it's possible that President Trump could cut off intelligence cooperation, Ukraine enjoys very strong bipartisan support in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. So I think it's fairly unlikely that the U.S. would end up cutting off intelligence.
All right, well, let's bring in Russia into this conversation. So do you see Russia viewing the US plan as an incentive to compromise or an opportunity to push for even more concessions?
Well, right now, because of the circumspect reaction of the Kremlin may realize that this plan just is not going to work, and it was negotiated by an amateur Russian negotiator, Kirill Dmitriev. So I imagine the Kremlin is now probably trying to figure out an alternative strategy to come up with a more credible negotiating position. Because the Ukrainians and the Europeans, they have the leverage, and Russia does not have much leverage. Remember, from the Russia standpoint, this has been a stalemate on the battlefield now for a couple of years in eastern Ukraine.
Now, you've mentioned Europe there, and European leaders are in agreement that they don't want a deal forged over Ukraine's head, and they also want to be part of the conversations and the negotiations of any deal. What's your take on Europe's position there?
So I believe Europe is on the right track because, again, it is providing the very substantial financial and military aid to Ukraine. And also, Europeans more and more, of course, realize that Russia's aggression in Ukraine is a direct threat to European security. Europeans didn't maybe realize this quite as much at the very beginning, but they sure do now. So Europe has the leverage, and Europe increasingly is acting as a geopolitical actor, and probably is going to use that leverage in order to insist that Ukraine be fully supported.
All right, we're going to leave it there, but really great to get your analysis, William. William Courtney, former US ambassador and adjunct senior fellow at the think tank RAND. Have a great evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.